Ardennes, Luxembourg. December 16, 1944, 05:30 hours. A cold fog sits on the valley of the Our River, and behind a stone farmhouse near the village of Marnach, a rifleman of the 110th Infantry Regiment is standing in a hole he dug 3 weeks earlier, when this was supposed to be the safest ground on the Western Front. He is cold in a way that has stopped being remarkable. He has been told by everyone above him that this sector is a rest area, a place where beaten-up divisions are sent to absorb replacements, clean their weapons, and sleep. The men here have a bitter joke about it. They call it the Ghost Front because nothing ever happens. He is one of roughly 5,000 men holding a line that a healthy army would have given to 4 times as many. His division has just come out of a forest in Germany where it lost more than 6,000 men in about a week. The faces around him are mostly new. Half of them have never fired a shot at a living enemy. The veterans among them are the ones who learned, in that forest, exactly how much a mistake costs. The weather that winter had been its own kind of enemy. December in the Ardennes brought freezing fog that hung in the river valleys for days, wet snow that soaked through boots and greatcoats, and a damp cold that never quite let go. It was the sort of weather that grounds aircraft, and that mattered more than anyone on the American side understood in those first hours. The Allies had spent the autumn dominating the skies over Western Europe, and much of their confidence rested on the certainty that if the Germans ever massed for an attack, it would be seen from the air and broken up before it started. But you cannot photograph what you cannot see, and for days the clouds had sealed the front under a grey lid. Behind that lid, in the forests on the German side of the Our, an entire army had been gathering in near total silence, moving by night, forbidden to light fires, straw wrapped around tank tracks to muffle the sound. The men in the foxholes along Skyline Drive had no idea that the quiet in front of them was not the quiet of a dead sector. It was the quiet of an army holding its breath, and then the horizon on the far side of the river turns white, not the white of snow, the white of muzzle flashes, hundreds of them at once, stitched across the German bank in a line that does not break. The barrage lands before the sound of it even arrives. Searchlights bounce their beams off the low clouds to make a strange artificial moonlight, and out of that light come men in far greater numbers than anything the intelligence maps had allowed for. The rifleman does not know it yet, but he is not sitting in a quiet sector. He is sitting in the exact center of the largest German offensive in the West in the entire war. He is directly in the path of an entire panzer corps, and the road that runs behind his back leads, in a straight and lightly defended line, to a small Belgian town called Bastogne that the German High Command needs to capture within 48 hours. The men on the far bank have a name for the division this rifleman belongs to. They had begun using it earlier that year, out on the hedgerows of France, when they first saw the blood-red patch on the shoulder of the men they were fighting. A red keystone, cut hard against the uniform that from a distance looked like a pail sloshing with blood. They called it the Bloody Bucket. It was meant as a mark of contempt and a kind of warning at the same time, a suggestion that anyone who tangled with these men would end up paying in blood. For the next 3 days on this exact patch of ground, that name is going to acquire a meaning neither side intended, because the story of what the Bloody Bucket did on the road to Bastogne is one of the strangest reversals of the entire war. A division that had just been broken, that was under strength and half green, that was sitting where it sat, precisely because someone had decided it was too damaged to be trusted with a real fight, is about to do the single most important thing any American division did in the opening hours of the Battle of the Bulge, and almost nobody remembers its name. To understand why that reversal matters, you have to understand something uncomfortable first. This division was not sent to a quiet sector by accident. It was sent there because 6 weeks earlier, it had been fed into one of the worst American defeats of the entire campaign in Western Europe, and it had come apart. To tell the story of the road to Bastogne honestly, you have to start in a forest where almost everything went wrong, and before the forest, you have to know who these men were, because the German contempt was misplaced from the very beginning. The 28th Infantry Division was not some hastily assembled wartime formation. It was, and still is, the oldest division-sized unit in the United States Army. Its roots reach back to a battalion of Pennsylvania volunteers associated with Benjamin Franklin in the 1700s. The division itself was formally organized under a Pennsylvania order in 1879. It was a National Guard division, made of Pennsylvania men, citizen soldiers who trained on weekends and in summers, and it carried the nickname the Keystone Division, because Pennsylvania is the Keystone State. The red keystone on the shoulder was a state symbol long before it was ever a target. In the First World War, these same men earned a different name. After they held their ground in hard fighting against the German summer offensive of 1918, the American commander, General John Pershing, was said to have called them Men of Iron, and for a generation they were known as the Iron Division. That was the reputation they carried into the Second War. So it is worth pausing on the darker nickname, the one the Germans used, because it has become tangled with legend, and getting it right matters. The popular version, repeated in countless retellings, says the Germans coined the term bloody bucket during the fighting in the Hurtgen forest, as a kind of grim tribute to the slaughter there. It is a good story. It is also almost certainly not true in that form. The best scholarship on this division tells a plainer tale. The name comes simply from the shape and color of the red keystone patch. To an enemy looking at it across a field, a red keystone can read as a lopsided pail, and once you see a bucket, the color does the rest. The Germans were already using the term by the late summer of 1944, out of the hedgerow fighting in France, months before the division ever set foot in the Hurtgen. So the timeline of the legend is simply backwards. There are two more honest caveats worth stating out loud, because most channels will not. No surviving German wartime document has ever been found that actually uses the German words for bloody bucket. The phrase reaches us through American retellings and later translations, and American soldiers themselves used the nickname during the war, printing it in their own unit histories, so it was never purely an insult hurled from the other side. The truthful version is this. The name came from the patch, the Germans used it, and used it as a taunt, and the Hurtgen, when it came, poured so much real blood into that image that the nickname stopped being a joke about a shoulder patch and became a description of what had happened to the men wearing it. The truth is less tidy than the legend, and more interesting for it. By the autumn of 1944, these men had already earned respect the hard way. They had fought across France after landing in Normandy in July. On August 29, 1944, the division was given an honor that stayed with its veterans for the rest of their lives. It marched in formation straight down the Champs-Élysées in newly liberated Paris, 24 abreast, in a parade that doubled as a movement to the front. The men marched through the cheering crowds and kept marching, right out the other side of the city, toward the German border, and the war still waiting for them. And then, on September 11, 1944, the division claimed a distinction that few could match. It said it was the first American unit to set foot in Germany itself, crossing the border and beginning to fight its way into the concrete pillboxes of the West Wall. In that border, fighting along the Our River, a sergeant of the division named Francis Clark performed the kind of action that earns the Medal of Honor, and he was awarded it. Over the following weeks, the division would destroy or capture more than 150 German pillboxes and bunkers. These were not amateurs. That is the point worth holding on to, because the popular version of this story wants the 28th to be underdogs who got lucky, and that is not what happened. Their commander was a man whose name deserves to be far more famous than it is. Major General Norman Cota. Everyone called him Dutch. On D-Day, he had not been with the 28th at all. He had been the assistant commander of the 29th Division, and he had gone ashore on Omaha Beach in the first hours, one of the most senior officers on that beach at its worst moment. The assault had stalled. Men were pinned against the seawall, dying where they lay, too shocked and too pinned down to move. Cota walked that beach through the fire. He organized the men, directed engineers to blow the wire with explosives, and pushed the advance up off the sand. There is a phrase credited to him from that morning, spoken to a group of rangers, that became the motto of the entire Ranger Regiment. He is said to have told them, "Rangers, lead the way." For his conduct that day, he received the Distinguished Service Cross. He took over the 28th in the middle of August, after the general who was supposed to command it was killed by a sniper only hours into the job. So this was not a mediocre officer commanding a second-rate outfit. This was a decorated hero of the most important amphibious assault in history, commanding one of the oldest and proudest divisions in the army. Hold that image, because what happened to them in the forest is going to make it hard to remember. That forest was the Hurtgen. It sits on the German border near the city of Aachen, about 50 square miles of steep ridges and deep gorges, packed with fir trees planted so close together that the light barely reaches the ground even at midday. It was, and remains, the longest single battle the United States Army fought in the entire war. And by any honest measure, it was a slow, grinding disaster. The American command wanted the high ground around a town called Schmidt, which controlled the approaches to a set of dams on the Rohr River. The 9th Infantry Division had already tried and been badly hurt. In the middle of October, the 28th relieved them and inherited, more or less, the same failed plan. Cota did not like it. His 3 infantry regiments were ordered to attack toward 3 separate objectives along diverging lines, which meant they could not easily support one another. Because other attacks along the front had been delayed, his division would be the only one attacking across a wide sector, which meant the Germans could concentrate against just his men. He raised these concerns with his superiors. He was reinforced with tanks and told to attack anyway. The attack jumped off on the morning of November 2, 1944. The results split 3 ways almost immediately. On the northern edge, one regiment ran into a minefield and a wall of fire within a few hundred yards and was stopped cold. On the southern edge, another regiment pushed into thick woods toward a fortified strongpoint and was simply chewed apart. By the time it was pulled out about 11 days later, nearly every infantry officer in its rifle companies had been killed or wounded. In the center, the 112th Infantry did something that looked, for one day, like a triumph. It took the village of Vossenac and the ridge it sat on. Then 2 of its battalions crossed a river gorge and captured the villages of Colmar and Schmidt itself, and at first there was almost no resistance. Cota, by one account, said he felt like a little Napoleon. For a few hours it looked like the plan had worked. The problem was the road they had crossed to get there. It was called the Cal Trail. It was not really a road at all. It was a narrow logging track that dropped 500 feet into a gorge, and at its tightest point, it was actually narrower than an American Sherman tank. Nobody had properly scouted it. Nobody had clearly been ordered to hold it or improve it. It was the only supply line to the men who had just taken Schmidt, and it was a thread. On the morning of November 4, the Germans counterattacked. Tanks and infantry hit Schmidt from 3 directions at once. The American battalion holding the town had no armor forward, because the armor could barely fit down the trail. The infantry broke and was driven out of Schmidt, falling back on Colmar. Of 8 Shermans that tried to crawl down the Cal Trail to help, only 3 reached the far side. Over the next few days, the Germans pushed the Americans back across the gorge, back to almost exactly where they had started. In the middle of that catastrophe, something happened on the Cal Trail that is worth telling, because it complicates the easy picture of who these enemies were. Down in the gorge, wounded Americans lay where they had fallen, cut off from any hope of evacuation. A German officer, a battalion surgeon and doctor named Günther Hurtgen, arranged an informal truce, a pause in the killing, so that the wounded of both sides could be treated and carried off the trail. For a span of hours, German and American medical personnel worked over the same broken men in the same gorge. It was one of the few moments of mercy in a battle that had almost none, and it says something true about the war that gets flattened out of the usual telling. The men trying to kill each other on that ridge were still, in the gaps between the fighting, capable of recognizing one another as men. When it was over, the numbers were staggering. In roughly a week of fighting, the 28th Infantry Division suffered 6,184 casualties. That is close to half of the division's strength, gone in a matter of days. The 112th Infantry alone, the regiment that had briefly taken Schmidt, lost more than 2,000 men, well over half of its strength. The division lost dozens of tanks and tank destroyers. On top of the killed and wounded, More than 700 men were taken out of the line by trench foot, the rotting of the feet that comes from days in freezing wet ground. It stands in the official history as one of the most costly division-sized attacks the American Army made in the entire war, and it gained almost nothing of lasting value. To this day, it is taught at the Army's Staff College as a case study in how not to fight a battle. This is the part of the story the German nickname seemed to confirm. The bloody bucket had been filled, and most of the blood was American. And it produced one more thing, a small human tragedy that has outlived almost everything else about the division, because it involved a decision that fell to Cota personally. Among the replacements sent to the 28th was a young private named Eddie Slovic. He was from Detroit, a man who had been in trouble as a boy and had genuinely believed he would never be drafted, and who was terrified of combat in a way he could not master. When he reached the front in the autumn of 1944, he told his officers plainly that he was too scared to serve in a rifle company, that he would run away if forced into the line, and he put it in writing. He was offered chances to tear up the statement and return to his unit with no charge against him. He refused every time. He seemed almost to want the record made. He was tried by a court-martial on November 11, 1944, found guilty of desertion and sentenced to death. Almost no one expected the sentence to actually be carried out. More than 20,000 American soldiers were convicted of desertion during the war, and dozens were sentenced to death, but not one of those sentences had ever been carried out. The confirmation, though, had to pass across the desk of the division commander, and that was Cota, at exactly the moment when his division had been bled white in the Hurtgen and was about to be thrown into the fight of its life. On November 27, Cota approved the sentence. His reasoning, which he gave afterward, was the reasoning of a man who had watched thousands of his soldiers stand and die when they were just as frightened. He said that given the situation as he knew it in November of 1944, he felt it was his duty to approve it, and that if he had let Slovic accomplish what he was trying to do, he did not know how he could have gone up to the line and looked a good soldier in the face. The final order came from the Supreme Allied Commander himself, General Dwight Eisenhower, who confirmed it in the last days of December, with the Battle of the Bulge at its height, and thousands of Americans dying in the snow. Eddie Slovic was shot by a firing squad, drawn from his own regiment on January 31, 1945, near a French village, and he was buried far from home, in a plot reserved for men executed for the worst crimes. He was the only American soldier executed for desertion since the Civil War, and he remains the last. The weight of that confirmation fell in part on the same man who had walked upright across Omaha Beach. It is a reminder that the men making these choices were not figures in a legend. They were exhausted human beings deciding the fates of other exhausted human beings, in a winter with no clean answers anywhere. But that came later. In the middle of November, the division was simply pulled out of the line to be rebuilt. It received thousands of fresh replacements. Young men straight from training who had never seen combat, poured in to fill the holes where veterans used to be. It was patched back up to something like 80% of its strength on paper, but a division is not a number on a page. Underneath the strength report, it was a wounded thing, full of strangers, led by officers who had just watched their commands disappear. And so the army did what seemed sensible. It found one of the quietest places on the entire Western Front, and it sent the 28th there to heal. Now here is the question that sits at the center of this whole story, and it is worth asking plainly. If this division was broken in the Hurtgen, if it was under strength and stuffed with green replacements and shaken to its core, then how, 6 weeks later, did it manage to blunt the tip of the greatest German attack in the West and buy the time that saved Bastogne? Why did the outfit the Germans mocked as a bucket of blood become the thing that stood in their way when standing in the way mattered more than anything else on the entire front? The easy answer is that the Americans fought bravely and got lucky. That answer is not good enough, and it is not really true. Bravery does not delay a panzer corps by itself. Luck does not hold a road junction for 3 days. The real answer has almost nothing to do with the fighting spirit that war movies love, and almost everything to do with 3 cold structural facts. Where these men were standing, what the ground behind them was worth, and a decision the German command had already made about time. To see it, you have to stop looking at the 28th for a moment and look at the map the way the German generals looked at it. The quiet place they were sent was the Ardennes, a region of forested hills and deep river valleys spanning eastern Belgium and northern Luxembourg. The 28th took over a section of the front behind the Aar River, along a ridge road the Americans called Skyline Drive, and the length of that front is the first thing that should stop you. The division was holding roughly 25 miles of line. Army doctrine held that an infantry division should defend something like 5 to 8 miles. The 28th was covering nearly 4 times the frontage it was ever meant to hold, with a division that had just been gutted. The line was not a wall. It was a string of outposts with long gaps between them, held together by hope and the assumption that nobody would attack. From north to south, 3 regiments held that line: the 112th Infantry on the northern flank, the 110th Infantry in the centre, the 109th Infantry to the south. Division headquarters sat in a Luxembourg town called Wiltz, and the corps headquarters they answered to, under Major General Troy Middleton, sat in a town a little further back, on the far side of a web of roads. That town was Bastogne. Bastogne is the hinge of this entire story, and the reason is geography. In this part of the Ardennes, the terrain is so broken, so full of steep valleys and dense woods, that armies cannot simply drive across open country. They are funneled onto the roads, and in the whole region, one town was the great knot where the roads came together. 7 paved roads met at Bastogne. Any German force that wanted to push armor west toward the Meuse River and beyond it toward the port of Antwerp had to control that road hub. You could not easily go around it. You had to take it. The German planners knew this perfectly. Their orders were explicit. Bastogne was to fall on the second day of the offensive, or be surrounded by then. Everything depended on speed, and the fastest, best paved road running west toward Bastogne ran directly through the sector held by the 110th Infantry, through Skyline Drive, through the villages of Marnach and Clairvaux, right across the foxhole of the cold riflemen we started with. The 28th was not simply in a quiet sector that got unlucky. It was sitting, without knowing it, squarely on top of the single most important road in the entire German plan. Now look at what was coming at them, because the imbalance is almost hard to believe. The German plan, known in English as Watch on the Rhine, threw 3 full armies into the attack. It was Hitler's personal gamble, an attempt to split the American and British armies, race to the port of Antwerp, and force the Western Allies to the negotiating table before the weight of American industry and Soviet numbers crushed Germany for good. It was built on secrecy, on bad weather that would ground the Allied air forces, and above all on speed. In the 28th sector, the blow was delivered by the 5th Panzer Army, commanded by one of the most capable German generals of the war, Hasso von Manteuffel, and the specific hammer aimed at the 110th Infantry was an entire Panzer Corps, the 47th, under General Heinrich von Luttwitz. It contained the 2nd Panzer Division, the Panzer Lehr Division, which was one of the strongest armoured formations in the German army, and the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, under General Heinz Kokott. Kokott's orders could not have been clearer about the schedule. Bastogne, he was told, should fall on the second day of the operation, or at the very least be encircled by then. The arithmetic of that first morning is brutal. The 110th Infantry, the regiment in the centre, could put roughly 5,000 men into the line, and one of its 3 battalions was held back in division reserve, so the real number on the front was smaller still. Facing them, across the river, the 47th Panzer Corps had around 27,000 infantry and something on the order of 216 tanks, assault guns, and tank destroyers. This was not a fair fight, and it was never meant to be. In the German plan, the 110th Infantry was not an obstacle to be fought. It was a crust to be broken on the first morning, brushed aside so the armour could pour through toward Bastogne on schedule. That is the setup. A shattered, rebuilt division, stretched 4 times too thin, sitting by accident on the most important road on the front, in the path of a force that outnumbered it many times over, defended in the centre by a regiment whose commander had only 2 of his 3 battalions to work with. By every reasonable calculation, this position should have collapsed in hours. The German timetable was built on the assumption that it would. It did not. What happened instead is the heart of this story, and it did not happen because the 28th was suddenly braver than it had been in the forest. It happened because of the specific way the fight unfolded on the ground, and to see it clearly, you have to get down out of the general's map and into the villages. The commander of the 110th Infantry was a Texan named Colonel Hurley Fuller. He was a hard, prickly, difficult man who had already been relieved of a regimental command once before, back in Normandy, and had been given this second chance by Middleton, who had known him a long time. Fuller understood his position was impossible. He could not hold a continuous line with 2 battalions across that much ground. So he did the only thing that made sense. Instead of trying to hold everything, he turned the villages themselves into strong points. He put companies of men into the stone houses of towns like Marnach, Hosingen, Holstum, Weiler, and Constum, sitting astride the roads, and he accepted that the Germans would flow into the gaps between them. His regimental command post was in a hotel in the town of Clairvaux, in the valley of the Clerf River, with an old castle nearby. The German barrage opened at 05:30 on December 16th. In the darkness before it, German infantry had already crossed the Our River in rubber boats and slipped between the American outposts. When the sun came up, the men in the villages found the enemy in front of them, beside them, and behind them, all at once. And here is where the German plan began to break, quietly, village by village. The German timetable needed those villages to fall fast. They did not fall fast. In town after town, the men of the 110th, surrounded and cut off, simply refused to leave. They fought from the stone houses, from cellars, from behind garden walls. Because the terrain forced the German armor onto the roads, and the roads ran through the villages, every hour that a village held was an hour the German tanks spent stalled or detouring instead of driving west. The village of Hosingen held the longest, and it shows the pattern most clearly. There, a company of infantry and a company of combat engineers, together only about 400 men, with a handful of tanks, held out against the weight of a German division for more than 2 days. Surrounded from the first day, shelled, running low on everything, they kept the Germans from using a critical stretch of Skyline Drive. They did not surrender until around the middle of the day on December 18th, and only when they had run completely out of ammunition, 2 days. From a garrison of 400 men who were supposed to have been swept away before breakfast on the first morning. At the village of Weiler, another company held so stubbornly, in a shrinking pocket surrounded on every side, that the Germans twice had to ask for a truce, simply to come forward and gather their own wounded from in front of the American positions. Think about what that means. In the middle of a lightning offensive that was supposed to sweep this ground clean in hours, the attackers were reduced to asking the men they were trying to destroy for permission to collect their dead. At Holstum and Constum, other companies fought the same kind of fight, holding stone buildings and crossroads long after any hope of relief had gone. At Marnach, the town nearest the river and first in the path of the armor, the 2nd Panzer Division was stopped cold in front of the village by men fighting with a stubbornness that clearly shocked the Germans attacking them. Each of these little garrisons faced the same impossible math. They were companies, a couple of 100 men at most, standing against the lead elements of full divisions. They had no way to stop what was coming, and most of them knew it. What they could do was make the Germans stop, deploy, fight, and clear each village one at a time, instead of simply driving through. Every crossroads that had to be taken by assault, instead of by driving past, was an hour, and sometimes half a day, stolen from a timetable that had no hours to spare. We do not have to guess at that shock, because the German commanders wrote it down. The commander of the 2nd Panzer Division, Colonel Meinrad von Laukert, described the American defenders of Marnach fighting with what he called a defiance of death he had never experienced before. And Manteuffel himself, the army commander, later admitted the plain truth in his own words. He wrote that the Clerf River was not reached at any point on the first day. He acknowledged that the enemy was clearly surprised by the attack, and yet in many places offered tenacious and brave resistance, fighting a skillful delaying battle, and that this resistance, together with the roadblocks, was among the most essential reasons the attack fell behind its timetable. That is the enemy commander, the man whose schedule was being wrecked, saying in effect that the bloody bucket had thrown his plan off from the very first day. Back at his headquarters, Cota gave the order his men would remember: hold at all costs. He released his last reserve, part of that held-back battalion, and sent it forward in a counterattack toward Marnac. There is an exchange that comes down to us from the retellings of that day, between Cota and Fuller, and it captures the spirit of the order, even if we should treat the exact words as remembered rather than recorded. Cota is said to have told Fuller that no one comes back, and Fuller is said to have answered, "No one comes back, sir." The counterattack failed. Most of the light tanks sent into it were destroyed. Marnac fell, but the clock kept running, and every hour was the thing that mattered. The center of gravity shifted to Clairvaux, the town in the river valley where Fuller his command post had, and this became the fight that the people of Luxembourg would later call their Alamo. German tanks came down the winding road from Marnac into the valley. In the streets of Clairvaux, the first real tank battle of the offensive in this sector went badly for the Americans, who lost far more armor than they destroyed. Fuller asked permission to pull his command post back, and was refused by his own division chief of staff. As German tanks fired directly into his hotel, Fuller escaped out a third-floor window onto an iron footbridge, leading a soldier who had been blinded in the fighting by the hand. He evaded the enemy for a short time, and then, on the night of December 18, he was captured. He would spend the rest of the war as a prisoner. A separate group of about 100 men made their stand in the old castle at Clairvaux. They held the stone keep, with its walls built for a different century, until the morning of December 18. They made their last radio call back to headquarters at Wiltz, and then, with the castle burning around them, they surrendered. The delay they and the others imposed was so severe that Lauschert, the armored commander, worried about how far behind he had fallen, had to peel off part of his force to go hunting for a different river crossing to the south, which cost him still more time. While the center burned, the flanks were bleeding time out of the German plan too. On the northern flank, the 112th Infantry, the same regiment that had been gutted at Schmidt, held its ground along the Our River for 2 days. And here, the terrain did the Americans an unexpected favor. When the Germans tried to push armor across the bridges in that sector, they found the bridges would not bear the weight of their heaviest tanks. That forced the German command to divert armor south to find another crossing, burning still more hours. The 112th eventually pulled back to the north, cut off from its own division, and attached itself to the defense of the town of St. Vith, where it went on fighting under a different command. On the southern flank, the 109th Infantry, now commanded by Lieutenant Colonel James Rudder, a man already famous for leading the Ranger assault up the cliffs of Pointe du Hoc on D-Day, fought a careful delaying action, trading ground for time and slipping back toward the town of Diekirch. As the flanks bent back and the center dissolved, the division's own headquarters town of Wiltz became the last stand. There was no longer a real front line to hold it, so the defense of Wiltz was cobbled together out of whatever men could hold a rifle. Combat engineers of the 44th Engineer Combat Battalion set up north of the town, and a provisional battalion was scraped together from the headquarters itself. Cooks, clerks, military police, bandsmen, truck drivers and supply men, men whose jobs had nothing to do with the front line, picked up weapons and formed a perimeter around the town. Around noon on December 19, the remnants of the 3rd Battalion of the 110th Infantry, perhaps 200 men, arrived to reinforce them, supported by a little armor and artillery. Early that day, Cota moved the division command post back toward Bastogne, and a lieutenant colonel named Daniel Strickler, who had fought his own delaying action back from Constam, took over the fight at Wiltz. That afternoon, the Germans attacked from nearly every direction, with paratroopers of the 5th Parachute Division and armor closing in. The engineers north of the town were overwhelmed and pulled back into Wiltz, blowing a bridge behind them. By nightfall, out of ammunition and completely surrounded, the defenders were told to break out toward the rear in small groups. Wilts fell that night. The breakout became a nightmare in the dark. Columns of men and vehicles ambushed on the narrow roads, and many of the men who slipped out of Wilts never made it back to American lines at all. Those who did were scattered, exhausted, and often unarmed, drifting west through a countryside that was filling up with German columns. Add it all up, and the cost to the 28th was appalling all over again. The 110th Infantry, that center regiment, had a combat strength of about 3,100 officers and men when the battle began. When the offensive had run its course, the regiment had been reduced to roughly 587. By the count of the Army's own historian, the regiment lost something like 2,750 men in about 2.5 days of fighting, and as an effective combat unit, it was simply gone. The division as a whole ended the month under strength by more than 4,500 enlisted men. Colonel Fuller, working from prisoners his men had forced to bury the German dead, estimated that his regiment had killed somewhere around 2,000 of the enemy before it was overwhelmed. Scattered survivors, men who had been cut off from their units, drifted west and were folded into the defense of Bastogne itself, gathered into improvised outfits, and thrown into the line beside the paratroopers who were about to make that town famous. Because that is what the 3 days bought: time. And to understand why time was the only thing that mattered, you have to know what was happening on the roads behind the 28th, while it died in the villages. When the offensive began, the closest American reserve that could plug the gap at Bastogne was the 101st Airborne Division, and it was far to the rear, refitting after hard fighting in the Netherlands. Late on December 17th, the order went out to move it. In the early hours after midnight, the division loaded up. Nearly 12,000 men, in something like 380 trucks, rolled through the night toward Bastogne. They began arriving on December 18th and 19th. And here is the entire point of the story, compressed into a single fact. They got there first. The 101st Airborne reached Bastogne and dug in before the German armor could take it. They got there first because the German armor was not there yet. And the German armor was not there yet because for 3 days it had been stuck fighting for stone villages it had expected to take before lunch on the first day. Bastogne was surrounded on December 20, and it would endure a brutal siege, and it would never fall. When a German officer came forward under a white flag to demand the town's surrender, the American commander there sent back a one-word reply that became one of the most famous answers in military history: nuts. General Patton's tanks broke through to relieve the town the day after Christmas. And the great German gamble, the whole desperate lunge for Antwerp, died far short of even its first objective. The plan had depended on capturing American fuel because the German columns did not have enough of their own to reach the coast, and on the weather staying bad enough to keep Allied aircraft grounded. Both of those bets failed, and they failed in part because everything ran late. The furthest west any German force reached in the entire offensive was the tip of the 2nd Panzer Division, the same division that had been slowed at Marnach and Clairvaux. Its spearhead ran out of fuel near the village of Selles, only a few miles short of the Meuse River at Dinant, and there, in the days after Christmas, with the skies now clear and Allied planes overhead, it was surrounded and destroyed by American armor. Only a few hundred of its men escaped on foot, leaving their vehicles behind in the snow. The tanks that had been meant to be across the Meuse in the first 2 days never reached the river at all. The drive to Antwerp ended in a frozen Belgian field within sight of the first water barrier, out of gas. Manteuffel, the German army commander, was one of the finest armored generals Germany produced, and he understood better than most what had gone wrong. He had wanted a shorter artillery barrage and a faster infiltration precisely because he knew the whole plan lived or died on the clock. And in his own account afterward, he laid a share of the blame exactly where it belonged. The attack, he acknowledged, did not go according to its timetable, and the tenacious resistance of the American defenders, fighting their skillful delaying battle from village to village, was among the essential reasons why. The reason the whole timetable was broken in its opening days, traces straight back to the road junctions of Luxembourg and the men who would not get off them. It is worth sitting with the German side of this a moment longer, because it explains why the delay was so much more damaging than a few lost hours might sound. The German plan was not merely optimistic about speed, it was completely dependent on it, in a way that left no room for the kind of resistance the 28th put up. The armoured spearheads did not carry enough fuel to reach the Meuse on their own. The plan assumed they would capture American fuel dumps along the way and drink from them. That assumption only worked if the columns kept moving, because a tank burns fuel whether it is advancing or sitting still in a traffic jam behind a burning village. Every hour the panzers spent stalled on the roads behind Clairvaux and Marnac was fuel spent for no ground gained. The plan also assumed the bad weather would last, keeping Allied aircraft grounded, and it assumed the Americans would be too surprised and too disorganized to plug the gaps before the armor was through them. The stand of the 28th attacked all three of those assumptions at once. It burned the German timetable, it burned German fuel, and it bought the days during which American reserves arrived, and, eventually, the skies cleared. When the weather finally broke a few days before Christmas and Allied planes swept over the Ardennes, the German columns that had been slowed at the very start were caught strung out and short of fuel, far short of where the plan said they should be. A delay measured in hours at the front translated, further back, into the difference between a breakthrough and a failure. You do not have to take my word for how decisive that was. Listen to the man who commanded the corps the 28th belonged to. Troy Middleton said afterward that the 110th Infantry, the regiment that was overrun, did a splendid job. He said it put up very stiff resistance for 3 days. And then he said the thing that matters most. He said that had that regiment not put up the fight it did, the Germans would have been in Bastogne long before the 101st Airborne ever reached the town. The commander who watched it happen said, in plain words, that the sacrifice of that regiment is what made the defense of Bastogne possible at all. So here is the reversal, laid bare. In the Hurtgen forest, the 28th Division attacked, and it was destroyed, and it gained nothing. 6 weeks later, in the Ardennes, the 28th Division defended, and it was destroyed again, and it gained the one thing the entire Western Front most needed. The difference was not courage. The men who broke at Schmidt and the men who held at Hosingen were, in many cases, the same men, or men just like them, from the same division under the same commander. What changed was not the soldiers. What changed was what their sacrifice was spent on. And that is the deeper truth this story is really about. In the forest, the 28th was asked to take ground, and ground in the Hurtgen was worth almost nothing. A ridge, a village, a stand of shattered trees, paid for at a price that brought no real advantage. The sacrifice was real, and the gain was empty. In the Ardennes, the 28th was not asked to take anything. It was simply, by accident of where it stood, in possession of the one thing the enemy could not do without: time on the roads to Bastogne. And so the same kind of sacrifice, the same broken companies and burning command posts and men fighting from cellars, produced a completely different result. Not because the fighting was better, but because this time the thing being bought was priceless. The German command had built its entire plan on a single assumption about that thin crust of American infantry along Skyline Drive. They assumed that a beaten, understrength division, stretched impossibly thin, would behave like a beaten division, that it would crack on contact and let the armor through. That assumption was not foolish. It was based on real knowledge. They knew what the Hurtgen had done to the 28th. They had, in a sense, helped do it. Their contempt was earned by the record, and it was exactly wrong, because the thing that decided the outcome was never the condition of the division. It was the value of the ground it happened to be standing on, and the willingness of ordinary men to sell that ground 1 hour at a time. There is one more layer to this that makes it sharper still. The men who held those villages were not, for the most part, the veterans of D-Day and the summer. Many of the veterans were dead or maimed in the Hurtgen. The line on December 16 was thick with replacements, boys who had been in uniform for a matter of months, standing in a foxhole in a foreign country, in the freezing dark, when the largest attack of the war in the West fell directly on their heads. And they held long enough. That is the part that resists every easy explanation. Green troops, in a broken division, in an impossible position, did the most important thing that was done on that front in those opening days, not by winning, by refusing to lose quickly. It is worth being honest here about what this delay did and did not do, because the story is powerful enough that it does not need to be exaggerated. The 28th did not defeat the German offensive. No single division did. The Bulge was broken over weeks by many hands. The defenders of St. Vith to the north, the engineers who blew the bridges, the cooks and clerks who held scratch lines, the paratroopers who endured the siege of Bastogne, the airmen who came out when the skies finally cleared, and Patton's army wheeling 90 degrees north to drive up into the German flank. What the 28th did was more specific and, in its narrow way, more decisive than any of those. It broke the schedule. The entire German plan was a race against the calendar, against the return of clear weather and the arrival of American reserves. By making the very first days cost far more than they were supposed to cost, the men on Skyline Drive helped ensure the Germans were always behind, always late, always arriving at the critical places just after the Americans had gotten there first. In a plan built on speed, imposing slowness was the most damaging thing anyone could do. And that is exactly what a division too broken to attack turned out to be perfectly placed to accomplish: the bloody bucket. The Germans meant it as a sneer, a mark for a division they intended to pour out onto the ground. And in the most literal sense they succeeded. The division was poured out. Twice. But the second time, the blood was spent on the only currency that could stop them, and it stopped them. The nickname, meant as contempt, ended up describing something closer to a sacrifice. A bucket carried to the exact spot where it needed to be emptied, and emptied there. It is worth pausing on the human cost hidden inside these numbers, because it is easy to say a regiment lost 2/3 of its strength, and hear only arithmetic. Behind those figures are men who spent their last hours in freezing cellars, in villages whose names they could not pronounce, firing until the ammunition ran out, and then fighting with whatever was left. Men who were captured and marched east into a captivity that would last until the war's end. Men who were listed as missing and never found. Many of them were replacements who had joined the division only weeks before, who had barely learned the names of the men beside them, and who died among strangers. The 28th was a Pennsylvania division in its bones, raised from towns like Scranton and Harrisburg and the coal country in between, but by that December it was an American division in the fullest sense, filled with young men from everywhere, thrown together and then thrown into the path of an army. The stand on Skyline Drive was not made by a legend. It was made by frightened, cold, ordinary people who did the job in front of them because the men on either side of them were doing it too. The division's war did not end at Wiltz. What was left of the 28th was pulled out, rebuilt one more time, and sent back into the fighting within weeks. In January of 1945, it was sent south to Alsace and attached to the French First Army for the reduction of the Colmar pocket, a stubborn German bridgehead that was the last major enemy foothold on French soil west of the Rhine. There, in bitter winter, fighting through fortified villages, the 28th had a hand in the liberation of the city of Colmar itself, the last great French city still in German hands. For its part in that fight, at the very end of January and the start of February, the division's 109th Infantry Regiment was awarded the French Croix de Guerre. It is a small detail, but it closes a circle. The regiment that fought the delaying action on the southern flank on Skyline Drive was decorated by France for helping to free one of France's own cities only weeks later. The men who had been mocked as a bucket of blood, broken in a German forest, and broken again on a Luxembourg ridge, kept fighting until the German army in the west was finished. The division crossed the Rhine into Germany, took up occupation duties, and was finally inactivated at Camp Shelby in Mississippi at the end of 1945. But its place in history was already fixed by those 3 December days. Norman Cota is the last thread worth pulling, because his own story mirrors his division's so exactly. He walked onto Omaha Beach a hero and walked off it a legend. He commanded the 28th through the worst defeat of its war in the Hurtgen and his reputation never fully recovered from it. He carried the terrible weight of the Slovak decision, the only execution of its kind in modern American history, and then he commanded the division through the 3 days in the Ardennes that saved Bastogne, an achievement that has been almost entirely swallowed by the more famous story of the paratroopers who held the town afterward. The man who said Rangers lead the way, on the most celebrated morning of the war, spent the darkest days of his career presiding over both the failure and the redemption of the same group of men. History has mostly remembered him for the beach and forgotten him for the road. That is the shape of the whole thing. We remember Bastogne because of the siege, the surrounded paratroopers, the one-word answer of defiance sent back when the Germans demanded surrender. Those men earned their fame completely. But the siege only happened because there was a town left to besiege, and there was a town left because for 3 days, out east along a ridge road in Luxembourg, a division that had already been declared broken stood on the roads and would not get off them. They did not hold the line. The line was gone by the 2nd day. What they held was the clock, and the clock was everything. The rifleman near Marnach, the one standing in his hole in the fog before dawn on December 16th, could not have known any of this. He could not see the map the German generals saw. He did not know that the road behind him was the most important road on the front, or that an entire panzer corps was aimed at the town in front of him, or that a division of paratroopers far to the rear was about to be woken in the night and rushed forward to a town he had probably never heard of. He knew only that the horizon had turned white, and that the order was to hold. He was a replacement, most likely, in a division everyone said was too damaged to fight, sitting in the one place on the entire Western Front where being too damaged to fight did not matter, because the only thing being asked of him was to stay, and to cost the enemy time, and to make them pay for every hour in the one coin the bloody bucket had always been willing to spend. They called the 28th the bloody bucket to insult it. In the end, the name turned out to be a fair description of the job. And the job, done by broken men on ground they never chose, is the reason Bastogne had defenders waiting when the Germans finally arrived. If this account brought a forgotten division back into focus for you, consider subscribing and leave a like. Stories like this one, about the units that paid the price for victories other people got to celebrate, only reach more people when you help push them there.